The wind cut across the high plains like a blade, sharp and merciless, driving dust through the narrow streets of the frontier town. A lone rider came in from the north trail, his horse gaunt, its hide clinging tight to bone, yet its pace steady, unfaltering. The man astride it wore the weather as if it were part of his skin, rough lines carved by cold nights, dark stubble clinging to his jaw, and eyes that had watched too many winters pass without warmth. He had the bearing of one who lived far from the noise of men, a creature of pine and stone and silence. Those who knew his name rarely spoke it with ease, for he carried with him the distance of the mountain he called home. He had not come for company, nor for trade of a common kind. His pack held the furs he had trapped in the wild, pelts thick and valuable, a hard season's labor pressed into rough bundles. They were meant to buy him salt, flour, powder, and shot, nothing more. Yet fate does not always bend to the plans of men. The crowd was already gathered by the time he reached the center of town. A raised platform had been built from splintered planks, crude but high enough to draw eyes. Voices carried on the dry wind, mingling curiosity with cruel laughter. The mountain man dismounted, tying his horse to a post, his gaze narrowing as he studied the scene. A man in a faded coat stood on the platform, shouting over the din, his words sharp and mocking. Before him, clutching her youngest child, stood a woman of delicate frame, her black hair loose and unkempt, her clothes torn by travel and hardship. At her side, 5 children clung together, their faces gaunt with hunger, their eyes wide with fear. The auctioneer called her a burden, a mouth too many for a starving camp, an unwanted weight left behind when men chose their pride over pity. Her husband had died, they said, illness, fever, or perhaps violence. But whatever the truth, she was left with nothing but children in a land where mercy was scarce. The settlers did not want her. They saw foreign skin, foreign tongue, and they looked away. The mountain man listened in silence, his jaw tight. He had seen men barter cattle, rifles, horses, even land itself, but never before had he seen human souls lined up like surplus stock. The woman's chin was lifted despite her trembling hands, and though her eyes glistened with despair, there was defiance buried in them. She had not surrendered. The bidding began low. Some laughed, tossing out mock offers of a few cents or scraps of tobacco, but none raised their hands. The crowd was crueler in its silence than in its jeers. A mother with 5 children in tow was no prize, only a burden that promised empty larders and long nights of hunger. The mountain man's hand moved almost without thought. He placed $6 silver on the rail, the sound of metal against wood cutting through the noise. The auctioneer blinked, surprised, then grinned wide, slamming his hand down with theatrical flourish. "Sold," he cried, pointing toward the silent figure in the weather coat. The crowd broke into whispers, then open laughter. The woman stared at the man who had claimed her fate. Her eyes narrowed, searching his weather-worn face for cruelty, for intent, for something she could grasp. The children clutched her skirts tighter, their bodies trembling. He gave no word, only turned and stepped down, waiting. She followed because she had no choice. Pride could not fill an empty stomach, and refusal would leave her children to starve or worse. He untied his horse, pulling a small cart behind it, and gestured for them to climb in. The eldest child helped the younger ones, his small frame shaking but his will steady. The woman lifted the youngest to her hip, and they settled into the rough wooden bed of the wagon. The road northward was long, stretching out of the town into the wild. No words passed between them, only the creak of wheels and the distant cry of crows circling above the fields. The mountain man's silence was not cruel, but heavy, as if he carried with him a lifetime of unspoken weight. The woman kept her eyes on her children, soothing them with murmurs in her tongue, her voice soft but strong. The children dozed one by one, their small bodies surrendering to exhaustion. The land grew harsher as the trail climbed. Pines rose in dark ranks, shadows stretching across the snow-streaked earth. The air thinned, sharp and cold. The wagon jolted over roots and stones, each bump waking the children with frightened gasps. He drove on without pause, his focus steady, his posture unyielding. By nightfall, they reached a clearing where a rough cabin stood against the slope of the mountain. It was built of logs, patched with hides, smoke curling faintly from a chimney of stone. To the woman, it looked like both prison and sanctuary, a place far removed from the scorn of men but equally bound by the silence of wilderness. He stabled the horse, unhitched the cart, and motioned them inside. The cabin was dim, lit by a small fire that cast shadows across the timber walls. A cot stood in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in another. Pelts lay across the floor, and bundles of dried herbs and meat hung from the rafters. It was sparse, but it was shelter. The children huddled near the fire, rubbing their hands, their breaths steaming in the cold air. The woman set down her youngest, wrapping him in a worn blanket she pulled from her bundle. The mountain man hung his coat on a peg, then crouched near the fire, feeding it with split logs until the flames rose. Only then did he speak, his voice low, rough from disuse. "You'll stay. Till spring." The words fell heavy, not cruel but resolute. The woman's eyes flickered. She did not understand every syllable, but she caught enough. She gave a short nod, drawing her children closer. The days that followed were etched in frost and silence. The mountain man rose before dawn, slipping out into the forest with rifle in hand. The woman tended to the children, warming broth from dried venison, mending their ragged clothes with thread she carried in a small pouch. When he returned, he brought meat, sometimes pelts, sometimes nothing at all. He shared without hesitation, setting food before them before taking his portion. The children watched him with fear at first, their eyes wide each time he entered the room. But fear began to dull, replaced by curiosity. The eldest, a boy barely into his teens, followed him one morning as he split logs outside. He said nothing, but when the man paused, the boy reached for a smaller piece of wood, lifting the axe with trembling arms. The strike was weak, but the intent was clear. The mountain man took the axe, split the log clean, then handed it back. The boy's hands tightened around the handle, determination burning in his gaze. Trust, fragile as ice on spring rivers, began to form, yet the silence held more than peace. It carried doubt, unspoken and heavy. At night, the mountain man lay awake on his cot, staring at the rafters, listening to the children's breathing. He had chosen them without thought, without reason he could name. $6, and now the weight of 6 lives rested on his shoulders. He asked himself why. Why a man who had walked alone for years, who had turned his back on blood kin and neighbors alike, would tie himself to strangers. No answer came, only the restless turning of his mind. The woman, too, carried her storms within. She did not know what kind of man he was, whether he meant to use her, cast her aside, or bind her in chains of another kind. But she saw how he set the food before her children first, how he patched the roof with his own hands when the wind tore at it, how he placed a pelt over her youngest without a word when the cold grew bitter in the night. She spoke little, but her eyes watched, weighed, measured. One evening, as snow fell thick against the window, a sound rose from the woods, a long, low howl, joined by others. The children stiffened, clinging to their mother. The mountain man stood, taking his rifle, opening the door to the night. Shadows moved among the trees, pale shapes slipping between trunks. Wolves, hungry and bold. He fired once, the shot echoing through the valley, scattering pack. Silence fell, broken only by the woman's whisper as she drew her children close. When he returned, snow clung to his shoulders, but his face remained calm. He closed the door, stoked the fire, and sat down without a word. The children stared at him, or mingling with fear. The woman met his gaze across the firelight, and for the first time, her lips moved in English. "Thank you." He gave a short nod, his expression unreadable, but something shifted in the space between them. Winter stretched on, each day binding them tighter in necessity and silence. The mountain man hunted, the woman cooked, the children gathered kindling and fetched water from the stream. The rhythm of survival became their bond, unspoken but unbreakable. Yet beneath it all lay the question neither dared voice. He had bought her with coin, but what had he truly taken upon himself? She had followed him from the town, but what life awaited her in the shadow of his mountain? One night, as the fire burned low and the children slept, the mountain man sat alone at the table, his hands resting on the scarred wood. The woman approached, her steps soft. She did not speak, only set down a small bowl of broth she had saved for him, then turned back toward the fire. He stared at the bowl, steam rising in the dim light, and a strange ache settled in his chest, an ache he had not felt in years, one born of quiet recognition. He lifted the bowl, drinking slowly, and when he set it down, his eyes lingered on her figure by the fire. She sat with her children gathered around her, their small bodies leaning into her warmth, her hand resting gently on the youngest's hair. She was not his wife, not his blood, not his kin, but she was here, and so were they, and the silence of the mountain no longer felt the same. The snow outside deepened, the wind howled against the cabin walls, and the night stretched long. But within, the fire glowed, fragile and steady, as if it knew that something had been set in motion, a story not yet told, a reckoning not yet faced. The mountain man closed his eyes, the woman's soft hum filling the silence, and for the first time in years he felt the weight of solitude lift, replaced by a burden far heavier, yet somehow more bearable. The storm would not break for many weeks, but already the path ahead had shifted. The mountain and the mother, bound now by chance and necessity, stood at the edge of something neither could yet name. The mountain did not soften as the weeks passed. Snow pressed down from the ridges in thick, white drifts, sealing paths, bending pines until they groaned under the weight. The cold seeped through the cabin walls at night, nipping at toes and fingers, testing the limits of fire and flesh. Each morning the mountain man rose before dawn, pushing into the bitter air with rifle and axe. Each day the woman kept the fire alive, the children close, and the silence between them intact. Their survival balanced on a knife's edge. Meat was not plentiful, and what little he brought back was stretched thin by 7 mouths. Dried venison simmered with melted snow in the iron pot, stretched with roots and herbs she carried in a small cloth bundle from her past life. She cooked sparingly, her hands deft, her eyes measuring every scrap as if it were gold. The children ate quickly, hungrily, their bowls licked clean, while she often left hairs untouched until the man gave a curt nod for her to take it. Even then, she ate lightly, giving the larger portion to the youngest curled at his side. The man noticed, though he said nothing. He had spent years alone, where hunger gnawed at the belly like a wolf in winter, where each meal came with the knowledge that tomorrow might bring none. Yet he had never known the taste of hunger when multiplied by 6. The sight of her quiet sacrifice stirred something inside him that had long been buried, a memory of a mother he barely recalled, a woman who had worked her hands raw so that her sons might eat. He pushed the thought aside, but it lingered like a ghost in the rafters. Trust was not won easily. The children still flinched at sudden movements, their eyes wary when he reached for his rifle or stepped too close. The eldest boy lingered near him, watching carefully, mimicking his tasks, splitting wood, carrying water, checking snares. The boy spoke little English, but understanding passing glances and gestures. The mountain man saw the spark of will in the child, a stubborn refusal to bend, and though he offered no words of encouragement, he allowed the boy to stand beside him, even handed him the axe when the wood was small enough for his young arms. The woman's suspicion was deeper. She studied him in silence, her eyes following him across the cabin, across the clearing, across the firelight at night. She did not ask why he had chosen them, why he had spent coin on what others had scorned. She did not trust generosity without reason, for her years had taught her that no man gave freely without debt to be paid. Yet as the days passed, she saw no cruelty in him, no attempt to break her will, no hand raised in anger. He carried himself with a heaviness that seemed older than his years, a solitude etched into his very skin. That solitude frightened her more than rage would have, for she could not read it, could not shape it, could not know if one day it would turn on her. One night, when the wind howled like 100 voices through the trees, the youngest child grew feverish. His small body boned, his breath shallow, his cries weak. The woman worked frantically, grinding herbs in a small bowl, boiling them in water, pressing the bitter liquid to his lips. The other children sat wide-eyed around her, whispering prayers in their mother's tongue. The mountain man stood aside at first, uneasy, unused to the sight of such desperation. But when the child breathing grew ragged, he moved. He went out into the storm, trudging through snow to fetch bark from the willow that grew by the frozen creek. His hands were raw by the time he returned, his face streaked with frost, but he set the bark before her without a word. She stared at it, then at him, realization flickering across her face. She brewed it quickly, feeding it to the child, her hands trembling. Hours passed with the storm battering the cabin, but at last the boy's breathing steadied, his fever breaking with the dawn. She sagged with relief, her head bowing over him. When she looked up, her eyes found the man's across the firelight. For the first time, her gaze did not hold suspicion, but something quieter, almost fragile. Days bled into weeks, each trial of survival binding them closer, though the silence between them remained. The wolves returned, testing the boundaries of the cabin, their eyes glowing in the dark beyond the firelight. The mountain man drove them off each time, his rifle cracking in the night, but he grew wary. Food was scarce for all creatures in that season, and hunger made boldness. He doubled the traps, checked the perimeter each morning, kept his rifle loaded and close. The eldest boy followed him one dawn, determined to prove himself. They tracked a rabbit through the snow, the boy stumbling but refusing to fall behind. When at last the snare snapped and the animal lay struggling, the man handed the knife to the boy. The child hesitated, trembling, but the man's steady gaze held him firm. The boy did what was needed, his face pale, his hands shaking, but his chin lifted with pride. That night, when the rabbit cooked in the pot, he sat straight at the table, his siblings watching him with newfound respect. Yet man was not the only enemy in the mountains. One afternoon, as the women and children gathered water at the stream, riders came. 3 men, rough-faced and reeking of whiskey, eyes sharp with cruelty. They reined in at the edge of the clearing, their gazes crawling over the cabin, over the woman, over the children who froze at the sight of strangers. The mountain man emerged from the trees, rifle in hand, his face a mask of stone. "Didn't know you kept company," one of the riders drawled, spitting into the snow. "Foreign company at that. Heard tell you bought yourself a bargain down in town." The others laughed, crude and mocking. The woman gathered her children close, her shoulders stiff, her face hard. The mountain man said nothing, his eyes locked on theirs, his finger resting near the trigger. $6, the man sneered. "Could have saved yourself the coin. Plenty of ways to take what ain't guarded." The silence stretched, heavy as storm clouds. Then, with a calmness that belied the tension, the mountain man raised his rifle and fired into the snow at their horses' feet. The animals reared, screaming, throwing the riders into chaos. The men cursed, fumbling for weapons, but his second shot cracked through the air, splitting bark from a tree inches from one man's head. The message was clear. They spat and cursed but mounted and rode off, their threats carried on the wind. When the sound of hooves faded, the clearing was still. The woman looked at him, her face pale but steady. She understood then that he had not brought them to cast them aside, nor to exploit their weakness. Whatever his reasons, he had chosen to stand between them and the world's cruelty. That night, as the fire burned low, she broke the silence again. Her English was halting, but her words were deliberate. "You protect. But why?" He did not answer. Perhaps he had none. Perhaps the answer lay buried too deep within him to surface. She did not press, only turned back to her children, but the question hung in the air, unspoken yet alive. The days grew harsher still. The snow deepened, food dwindled, and weariness carved into their bones. The mountain man pushed himself harder, hunting longer, traveling farther, his steps dragging but unbroken. He thought of the faces that had haunted him for years, faces of kin lost to anger, to pride, to the wars that had burned across the land. He had fled them, fled the weight of blood and expectation, choosing solitude over the ache of failure. Yet now, in this cabin filled with voices not his own, he found himself fighting again, not for himself, but for those who depended on him. One evening, after a long silence, he spoke, his voice low. "I lost once. A family." The words were rough, torn from him like bark from a tree. "Didn't think I'd have one again." The woman listened, her eyes steady, her face unreadable. She did not offer comfort, only understanding. Sometimes silence was the truest reply. The weeks dragged, each one testing their endurance, but the rhythm of survival became a bond no words could shape. The eldest boy began to laugh again, the younger ones to play in the snow near the cabin, their voices carrying through the trees like fragile birdsong. The woman's face softened, though her weariness never vanished entirely. And the mountain man, though still silent, began to carry himself with a steadiness that came not from solitude, but from responsibility. As winter's grip began to loosen, the first cracks of thaw whispering through the forest, the mountain man stood one dawn at the edge of the clearing, watching the mist rise from the snow. The woman joined him, her shawl wrapped tight, her children still asleep inside. They stood side by side, silent, the frost glowing around them. Neither spoke of the storms they had weathered, nor of the trials yet to come, but the weight of what had passed between them, fear, suspicion, survival, was written in the quiet way they did not move apart. The mountain had not grown softer, but something within them had shifted. They were no longer strangers bound by coin. They were a fragile unit, born of necessity, tempered by hardship. Trust had not yet blossomed into comfort, but the first shoots had broken through the frozen ground. And though the thaw promised change, it also promised danger, for with the spring came men who would not forgive what they did not understand. The silence of the wilderness would not guard them forever. Spring crept into the mountains slowly, first as a whisper in the trees, then as rivulets running beneath crusts of snow. The ice broke in the creek with a sound like thunder, scattering shards downriver. Pines dripped, heavy with melt, and the air grew sharp with the scent of earth unbound. In the clearing, the cabin no longer stood in silence. The children's laughter returned, tentative at first, then bold, chasing one another through patches of thawed grass. The woman watched them with cautious joy, her face softened in the rare warmth of sunlight, though the shadows in her eyes never vanished. The mountain man, leaning against a post near the stable, studied them in silence. The winter had forged them together, necessity welding strangers into something closer, though none of them spoke the word family. Yet as the thaw deepened, a weight pressed on him. Winter's silence had shielded them, but spring would carry word beyond the valley, and word traveled fast, even to those he had hoped never to see again. It came one morning with the sound of hooves. The children froze, their laughter clipped short, the woman clutching her youngest to her breast as 3 riders entered the clearing. They were not strangers. The mountain man's jaw tightened as recognition struck. 2 were his brothers by blood. Many had left behind years ago when pride had shattered what little kinship they shared. The 3rd was his uncle, older, sterner, the man who had once ruled a family with an iron hand. Their faces were carved from the same stone as his, but theirs bore the scorn of men who believed themselves wronged. "You shamed us," the elder brother spat, sliding from his saddle. His eyes cut toward the women and the children, narrowing with disgust. "Dragging filth into the mountains, calling it yours." The uncle dismounted slower, his movements deliberate. $6, they said. "You paid coin for her. You think that makes it right." His voice rumbled like distant thunder, heavy with judgment. The woman stiffened, her children pressing close. The mountain man stepped forward, his body forming a barrier between them and the intruders. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "They are mine now." "Yours?" the second brother sneered. "They ain't your blood, ain't your kind. You dish in a father's name, taking in scraps the town cast off." The silence between them grew taut, like a bowstring ready to snap. The mountain man's hands twitched near his belt, but he did not reach for his rifle. His heart pounded with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years, a mixture of shame, fury, and something fiercer, defiance. For so long he had lived apart from them, nursing the wounds of old quarrels, believing solitude his only shield. Now, faced with the scorn of his kin, he realized the choice before him was no longer about himself. It was about them, the women, her children, fragile yet unyielding in their will to survive. "They've got no one else," he said finally, each word clipped and sharp. "No one but me. That's enough." The uncle's eyes hardened, his jaw set. But before more could be spoken, the forest broke with sound. The snap of branches, the thud of hooves, the crack of laughter carried on the wind. From the trees spilled another group of riders, bandits, faces masked with scarves, rifles slung across their backs. The same men who had tested him in winter now returned emboldened, drawn by hunger and rumor. "Well, look what we found," one called, his voice mocking. "A cabin fat with mouths, and maybe something worth taking." The children screamed. The woman herded them toward the cabin. The brothers cursed, pulling weapons, while the mountain man seized his rifle, his body coiled like steel. The uncle barked orders, but chaos drowned him out as the bandits charged. Shots split the air, echoing across the valley. Snow and mud churned under hooves as the fight crashed into the clearing. The mountain man fired, the recoil slamming into his shoulder, dropping one rider from his horse. He spun, reloaded, and fired again, each shot measured, each breath steady despite the storm around him. His brothers fought beside him, unwilling allies in the face of a common foe. The uncle's pistol roared, his face grim with the knowledge that judgment could wait while survival was decided. Inside the cabin, the woman barred the door, pressing her children behind her. Her hands shook, but her eyes burned with fire. When a bandit broke through the window, she seized a log from the hearth, striking with a force born of desperation. He fell back, cursing, blood streaking his face. She did not pause, dragging the table against the window, her children clutching at her skates. Outside, the mountain man grappled with a rider who leapt from his horse, the two crashing into the mud. Fists struck, knives flashed, blood mingled with thawed earth. Pain seared his side where steel found flesh, but he drove his attacker down, choking him until his body stilled. Rising, breath ragged, he saw another bandit raise his rifle toward the cabin. Without thought, he hurled his knife, the blade striking true, the man collapsing before he could fire. The fight raged like a storm until at last the bandits broke. Their numbers thinned, their courage shattered. They fled into the trees, curses fading into the distance. The clearing fell silent but for the ragged breaths of those left standing. Blood streaked the snow, mingling with the thaw, the air thick with smoke and iron. The mountain man staggered, clutching his side, but refused to fall. His brothers stared at him, their faces pale, their judgment shaken. The uncle stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked between the man, the woman, and the children who now peered from the cabin door. Something in his gaze shifted, not acceptance, not approval, but recognition of a truth he could not deny. "You've bound yourself to them," he said at last, his voice low. "Not by blood, not by name, but by choice. That's weight enough." The mountain man said nothing. His body ached, his blood dripped into the mud, but his stance was unbroken. He had chosen, and that choice stood like stone against the tide. His kin, silent, mounted their horses once more. No blessing was given, no forgiveness offered, but neither did they call him traitor again. They rode off into the trees, their figures swallowed by the forest. When the clearing was quiet, the woman stepped forward. Her eyes met his, steady, unwavering. She spoke softly, her words simple yet carrying the weight of truth. "You fight for us. We fight for you." The children gathered around him, their small hands clutching his coat, their eyes wide with something new, trust, fierce and unshaken. He looked down at them, at her, and though word did not come easily, the ache in his chest told him what silence could not. They were no longer strangers bound by coin. They were his. Days later, when the wounds had begun to heal and the earth had opened to spring, the mountain man stood at the edge of the clearing, the sunrise spilling gold across the peaks. The woman joined him, her shawl pulled tight, her children laughing in the thawed grass behind them. They did not touch, did not speak, yet the air between them hummed with the weight of shared survival. He had thought himself a man condemned to solitude, burdened by ghosts, chained by choices long past. Yet here, against all reason, he had found something stronger than solitude. Not love, not yet, perhaps not ever in the way stories told it, but something true. A bond forged not by blood or law, but by fire, hunger, and the will to endure. The mountains would not grow softer. Men would not grow kinder. The world would not cease to scorn what it could not understand. But within this clearing, within this fragile, unyielding circle of trust, there was enough. Enough to face the storms yet to come, enough to stand when the world turned cold again. The woman's eyes caught his in the morning light, and for the first time she smiled, not wide, not bright, but real. It was not a promise, not a surrender, but an acknowledgment, a recognition that they were bound, not by the 6 coins that had begun their story, but by the choices made after, in silence, in blood, in fire. The mountain man turned back to the sunrise, the weight in his chest no longer a burden, but a mantle. He had chosen, and he would not turn back. The reckoning had come, and with it, resolution, not in forgiveness from those he had left behind, but in the bond he had forged with those who had nowhere else to go. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling its light across the thawing land, the cabin behind them stirred with life. The laughter of children carried on the breeze, fragile yet defiant, echoing through the valley like a promise that could not be broken.